All right, this is our 15th episode of Bible Basics, and this one is a continuation of what we started last time on the internet and pop culture and how it has affected people's perception of the Bible, and specifically how it's affected their perception of the history of the Bible, how the Bible came to be. And I said we'd talk about Dan Brown. I don't think we actually got to him last time, but you might have seen him in the airport somewhere, or at least seen this book in the airport newsstand. These little book stands they have in the airport, at least when I used to go through them. They don't have room to have a lot of books. So the only books they want to have are ones that move off the shelves. And Dan Brown knows how to move books off the shelves. This book, The Da Vinci Code, last time I checked, has sold over 80 million copies. I can't remember when it first came out, but let's see if we've got the date here. It says copyright 2003 by Dan Brown. So I guess that's when it first came out. 80 million copies. Just to give you an idea of how much that is, let me read you what a typical fiction non-seller does. This is from Google's AI. A typical fiction bestseller sells between 10,000 and 100,000 copies in its first year. However, to make a national bestseller list, a book often needs to sell between 7,000 and 12,000 copies in 1 week. Some books, like those on the New York Times bestseller list, may even sell more, potentially reaching 3 million copies in a single year. In other words, that's a huge bestseller if you sell 3 million copies in 1 year. This thing has sold 80 million copies. 80 million. And so this is just, I don't know if it's the best-selling fiction book. Certainly not the best-selling book of all time, because that is the Bible. They don't put it on the bestseller list anymore, but that's just part of the whole censorship thing. Let's keep Jesus and the Bible out of life. But it's not working because here I am, or at least here I am as long as YouTube allows me to be here. But many people have seen this book, and not just seen the book, but the movie. They don't really count people that go to movies, but they give you the box office. The box office on the movie that was made from this book, The Da Vinci Code, was $750 million last time I checked. $750 million. That doesn't count the popcorn. And at the time, it was the most popular movie Tom Hanks had ever made. And even today, this year, 2025, there's only two movies that, or three movies that where that Tom Hanks has been more popular in, and that's a couple of the Toy Story movies, or two of them, and Forrest Gump. So between the book and the movies, of course, a lot of people that went to the movies would have read the book too, but then there's a bunch of people who go to the movies who don't read the book. The point is, millions of people have read this book. And it has, it teaches things about the Bible. It's supposed to be one of these historical novels where it takes a historical setting and then tells a story in it, sort of like the Titanic movie, where James Cameron, I think his name was, took the story of the Titanic and then superimposed upon it this romance between Leonardo, not Da Vinci, but DiCaprio, and Kate Winslet portrayed this fictional romantic couple. So you watch the movie, and the movie was amazing replication of the Titanic itself. But anyway, that was the idea that Dan Brown had here for his story, for his book, and then later his movie. And there are passages in it where he says here, because Constantine, talking about the Emperor of Rome, Constantine upgraded Jesus' status almost 4 centuries after Jesus' death. Thousands of documents already existed chronicling his life as a mortal man. To rewrite history books, Constantine knew he would need a bold stroke. From this sprang the most profound moment in Christian history. Now, this is poppycock. He's portraying, he's got a historical setting, but Dan Brown is misreporting what the history is. He's trying to say that Jesus was known throughout all the ancient churches as having been simply a mortal man, but Constantine, having become a Christian himself, decided he wanted to make Jesus God, and so he called the Nicene Council. He did call the Nicene Council. It was the first ecumenical council. He did call it, and they did vote on things, but Dan Brown portrays it as the place where Constantine converted Jesus from being a mere man to being God, and that changed history. And he goes on to say, and this is how it applies to the Bible, it says Constantine commissioned and financed a new Bible. Now, he did do that, but it wasn't, quote, a new Bible. It may have been some of the first Bibles ever made. That's a whole other story. But it says he specifically omitted those gospels that spoke of Christ's human traits and embellished those gospels that made him godlike. This is just pure poppycock. He's making this up that Constantine chose what was going to be a Bible. There's no evidence in history that he did anything like that. The earlier gospels were outlawed, gathered up, and burned. An interesting note Langdon added, that's one of the characters in this book. Anyone who chose the forbidden gospels over Constantine's version was deemed a heretic. And those who chose the original history of Christ were the world's first heretics. Well, there's a lot of people reading this book and going, this movie, they can't tell when Dan Brown has stopped being historical and started being fictional. With Titanic, you could pretty easily tell when the story's transferring back and forth. Here, you can't, because Dan Brown is not only superimposing his fictional story in a historical setting, he's actually changing the historical setting. So much so that even Bart Ehrman, who you've heard me talk about in these series, modern critical scholar of the Bible, he wrote a book detailing everything that Dan Brown got wrong. So let's see, what was that called? I'm not sure, but it was, he had to get, it was so bad, Dan Brown's depiction of this was so bad that Bart Ehrman had to write a book detailing the things that Dan Brown got wrong. But how many people, are all those moviegoers going to read Bart Ehrman's book about what Dan Brown got wrong? I don't think so. And even if they did, they'd be correcting on what Dan Brown got wrong, but then they'd be all messed up by what Bart Ehrman taught them, because he's as harmful to a true knowledge of the history as Dan Brown in a different way. And we've talked about that, and I'm sure it'll come up again. But this is how people's minds get changed, by encountering lies and deceptions. We could argue all day about why Dan Brown did this. It wasn't necessary for his story. Well, maybe it was necessary to us. Maybe that was how he made his story more interesting to people. But it's just not the truth. And if you want the truth in life, you got to look for it. You got to find it. It doesn't come easily. Lots and lots of lies. The Bible is history. Its history can be known and understood, but you got to sort through a lot of chaff to get to the wheat. Okay? That's all for today.